Okay, so ready for a deep dive into some serious constitutional controversy.
Okay.
We're talking about a document called the Articles of Freedom, and let me tell you, it is a wild ride.
It's like a group of citizens got together and said, we're taking the Constitution back to its roots. This document is their manifesto, their call to action.
And the thing is, this wasn't just some fringe group. We're talking about citizen delegates from 48 states who held their own Continental Congress back in 2009.
They were deeply unhappy with the direction of the government.
They believed it was time for a major correction.
And when they say major, they mean it. One of the most striking things about the Articles of Freedom is its connection to libertarianism.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. They felt very strongly that the government had overstepped its boundaries and were advocating for a serious reduction in its power.
And they were not afraid to challenge some deeply ingrained systems in the U.S. government. Get this. They claimed that the 16th Amendment, the one that allows for a federal income tax, was never actually legally ratified.
They called it void, an unconstitutional tax on labor. Talk about fighting words. They even went so far as to demand the release of anyone imprisoned for tax violations.
Wow.
I bet that got some attention.
That'll definitely turn some heads. It really makes you stop and think, like, wow, these people were serious. This wasn't just about tweaking a few policies. They were calling for a fundamental shift in the relationship between citizens and their government.
Exactly. They believed that individual liberty had been eroding for far too long, and they saw the Constitution as the key to restoring it. They meticulously listed out their grievances, and what they called the capstone grievance really gets to the heart of their argument.
Okay, so what is the capstone grievance? Lay it on me.
They claimed that the government had consistently ignored the people's First Amendment right to petition for a redress of grievances.
Oh.
Basically, they felt like they were being silenced, that their concerns were falling on deaf ears.
So it was like they were saying, we've tried playing by the rules, speaking up through official channels, but the government isn't listening. So now we're taking matters into our own hands.
Precisely. They believed that ignoring these petitions was a clear sign that the government was no longer accountable to the people. They saw it as a breach of trust that demanded a bold response.
And a bold response they delivered. They dove deep into the Constitution, analyzing its articles and amendments, and emerged with a plan to restore what they saw as the Founding Fathers' vision.
And this is where their libertarian leanings become even more apparent. They argued that the government had assumed powers never granted to it by the Constitution, particularly when it came to issues like international involvement and land ownership.
For instance, they claimed the U.S. had essentially given up its sovereignty by getting chummy with international organizations like the UN and the IMF.
It's like they were saying, we need to untangle ourselves from these global entities and reassert our independence. They were fiercely protective of national sovereignty and deeply suspicious of what they perceived as a growing globalist agenda.
So in their eyes, it was a slippery slope from cooperating with international organizations to sacrificing national interests and surrendering autonomy.
Absolutely. They saw it as a threat to self-determination and a betrayal of the principles of limited government. This deep suspicion of globalism, combined with their stance on the income tax, really underscores the libertarian spirit that permeates this document.
It's pretty fascinating to see such a bold and unapologetic expression of these ideas. And they didn't stop there. They also had a lot to say about the power of juries, right?
That's right, and this is where things get really interesting. They argued that juries should have the right to judge not just the facts of a case, but also the law itself.
Hold on, you mean they wanted juries to have the power to say, we think this law is unjust, so even if this person broke it, we're not going to convict them?
That's exactly it. They believed that everyday citizens, not just legal scholars or elected officials, had the right to interpret the Constitution and judge the validity of the laws governing them.
Wow, talk about putting power back in the hands of the people. It's a radical concept, but you can see how it aligns with their overall philosophy of limited government and individual liberty.
Precisely, they saw it as a crucial safeguard against tyranny, a way to ensure that the legal system remained accountable to the people it was meant to serve. This belief in the wisdom and discernment of ordinary citizens is a common thread that runs throughout the Articles of Freedom.
It's like they were trying to create a system where the government was constantly kept in check, constantly reminded that it derives its power from the consent of the governed. And this idea extended to how they viewed property rights as well.
Absolutely. They were adamant about protecting private property, seeing it as fundamental to individual freedom and economic prosperity. In their view, any encroachment on property rights was a direct assault on liberty itself.
They went as far as to rail against the concept of a global commons, which was gaining traction around that time. The idea that some resources belong to humanity as a whole.
They saw it as a slippery slope, a threat to private property rights, particularly for landowners. They were concerned that international bodies could use this concept to justify seizing control of resources, potentially even within the U.S. borders.
So for them, it was all about drawing a hard line in the sand, protecting individual liberty, limiting government power, and safeguarding private property. Those were their non-negotiables.
Precisely, they believed these principles were essential to preserving the American experiment in self-government. Whether you agree with their conclusions or not, there's no denying the passion and conviction behind their arguments.
Okay, so we've talked about their grievances, their core beliefs. But what did they actually plan to do about it? It's not like they were just going to sit around and complain.
Oh, absolutely not. The Articles of Freedom is more than just a list of complaints. They lay out a detailed plan of action, encouraging citizens to get involved on multiple levels.
So they weren't messing around. They were serious about making a change. What did this call to action look like?
Well, they had a multi-pronged approach. Recognizing that change could come from different levels of government and through different forms of civic engagement, they called for everything from lobbying legislators to forming citizen grand juries.
Wow.
They even suggested economic sanctions as a last resort.
Economic sanctions. Wow, that's taking things to a whole new level. It really shows how committed they were to their cause. It makes you wonder what that would look like in practice.
It's a fascinating question to consider. Remember, they felt like their concerns had been ignored through traditional channels, so they were willing to explore more unconventional, even radical tactics.
They were ready to shake things up. It reminds me of that famous line from the Declaration of Independence about the right to alter or abolish a government that's become destructive of its ends.
There's definitely a parallel there. They saw themselves as heirs to that revolutionary spirit, defending the principles of self-governance and individual liberty.
So let's get into the specifics of their plan. What were some of the key actions they advocated for at the federal level?
One of their main goals was to rein in what they saw as unchecked federal power. They wanted to see a significant reduction in the size and scope of the federal government, arguing that it had grown far beyond its constitutional limits.
Less government intervention, more power to the states and individuals. It's a classic libertarian argument, and it fits perfectly with what we've seen so far from the Articles of Freedom.
Exactly. They believed that a return to the principles of federalism was essential to restoring the balance of power envisioned by the Founding Fathers.
So how did they propose achieving this? Did they have specific legislative reforms in mind?
They did. They called for a review of all federal statutes and the repeal of any law that couldn't be justified by a strict interpretation of the Constitution. They argued that if a power wasn't explicitly granted to the federal government, it should be reserved for the states or the people.
Wow, that's a pretty radical proposal. It would mean a complete overhaul of the federal legal code.
It's definitely a bold vision, and it shows just how serious they were about limiting the reach of the federal government. They were essentially saying, let's go back to the drawing board and make sure everything the federal government does is firmly grounded in the Constitution.
And it wasn't just about repealing existing laws, was it? They also proposed some interesting ideas for new institutions, like this Joint Committee for Constitutional Governance they kept mentioning. What was that all about?
Yes, that was one of their more intriguing proposals. They envisioned this committee as a watchdog tasked with reviewing all bills before they became law to ensure they aligned with the Constitution.
So a kind of built-in constitutional check within the legislative process. That's a pretty neat idea.
Right. It's like having a dedicated team of constitutional scholars on hand to say, hold on, does this bill actually square with the principles of limited government and individual liberty?
And this committee wouldn't just be giving rubber stamps of approval. They would actually have the power to send bills back to Congress with objections.
Precisely. They wanted to make sure it wasn't just a symbolic gesture, that it had real teeth. They even went so far as to propose specific timelines for review to prevent unnecessary delays in the legislative process.
It sounds like they put a lot of thought into how this committee would function, ensuring it was both effective and efficient.
Absolutely. They were meticulous in their approach, wanting to create a system that was both practical and principled.
But their recommendations weren't limited to the federal level, were they? They also had a lot to say about the role of states in pushing back against what they saw as federal overreach.
You're right. They believed that states had a crucial role to play in upholding the Constitution and protecting individual liberty. In fact, they put a lot of emphasis on the doctrine of interposition.
Okay, I have to admit, doctrine of interposition sounds a bit intimidating. Can you break that down for me? What does it actually mean?
Essentially, it's the idea that states have the right and the duty to protect their citizens from unconstitutional federal laws. Think of it like this. If the federal government passes a law that a state believes is unconstitutional, that state can essentially step in and refuse to enforce it within its borders.
So it's like a state saying, we're drawing a line in the sand. We believe this federal law violates the Constitution, and we're not going to participate in enforcing it. That's a pretty bold stance.
It is. It's based on the idea that states have a certain level of sovereignty and aren't obligated to blindly follow every federal mandate, especially if they believe those mandates infringe on the rights of their citizens.
And the authors of the Articles of Freedom were big proponents of states exercising this right of interposition.
Oh, absolutely. They saw it as a vital tool for pushing back against federal overreach. They even called for states to pass state sovereignty resolutions, formally declaring their right to deem federal laws null and void if they believed those laws exceeded the powers granted to the federal government by the Constitution.
So it was about sending a clear message to the federal government. We're not just going to sit back and let you trample on our rights. We're prepared to stand up for what we believe in.
Exactly. They wanted states to be more assertive in defending their own sovereignty and the rights of their citizens.
And they didn't stop there, did they? They also had some pretty strong opinions about federal funding and how it impacted state autonomy.
You're right. They believed that relying on federal funding often came at a cost, that states could become beholden to the federal government, willing to compromise their principles in exchange for financial support.
So it was about more than just money. It was about power and control.
Absolutely. They saw federal funding as a way for the federal government to exert influence over states, potentially undermining their ability to govern themselves according to their own values and priorities.
So what did they propose states do about it?
They recommended a pretty radical solution, refusing all federal funds that weren't explicitly authorized by the Constitution.
Wow, that's a bold move.
Yeah.
I imagine that would have huge implications for state budgets. It makes you realize just how deeply they believed in the importance of state autonomy.
They were willing to make sacrifices to take a stand on principle, even if it meant facing financial challenges. They believed that true sovereignty required financial independence, that states couldn't be truly free if they were constantly reliant on federal handouts.
It's a fascinating perspective, and it raises some important questions about the relationship between federal and state governments. But their vision didn't end with government institutions, did it? They also called for action at the individual level, right?
Absolutely. They recognized that lasting change required more than just legislative reforms or political maneuvering. It required a shift in mindset, a renewed commitment to civic responsibility, and personal accountability. They called on individual citizens to step up and play an active role in shaping the future of their country.
So it wasn't just about changing laws or restructuring government. It was about changing hearts and minds, about fostering a more engaged and informed citizenry.
Exactly. They believed that a healthy republic relied on citizens who were informed about their rights, willing to challenge injustice, and prepared to hold their leaders accountable. It was about fostering a sense of ownership over the future of the country.
And they offered concrete steps that individuals could take to reclaim that ownership right. What do they suggest people do?
Well, they were big proponents of education. They encouraged citizens to study the Constitution, to understand its history and its principles, so they could better recognize and resist any attempts to undermine it. They also emphasized the importance of participating in the political process, urging citizens to vote, to contact their representatives, and to run for office themselves if they felt called to do so.
So it was about empowering people to become active participants in their own governance, not just passive observers.
Exactly. They understood that a government of the people, by the people, for the people, requires an engaged and informed citizenry. They believed that the future of the republic rested not just in the hands of elected officials, but in the hands of ordinary citizens who were willing to stand up for their rights and the principles they held dear.
It's a powerful message, and it really resonates even today. But they didn't just talk about civic duty in a general sense. They also identified specific issues that they felt required immediate attention, didn't they?
You're right. While they presented a broad vision for restoring constitutional governance, they also zeroed in on specific grievances that they felt illustrated the need for change. And one area that particularly troubled them was the erosion of privacy rights. especially in the wake of the Patriot Act, which had been passed just a few years before the Articles of Freedom was written.
Yeah, that's something I think a lot of people can relate to, even today. It feels like that whole debate around security versus privacy is always evolving,
Yeah.
especially with technology advancing so rapidly. What exactly did they find objectionable about the Patriot Act?
Well, they saw it as massive government overreach, a violation of the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. They felt like it gave the government way too much power to pry into the lives of ordinary citizens, all in the name of national security.
It sounds like they were drawing a very clear line in the sand, saying that even the threat of terrorism doesn't justify sacrificing fundamental freedoms.
Exactly. They argued that true security comes not from sacrificing liberty, but from upholding it. They called for the repeal of the Patriot Act and any other laws that they felt infringed on the Fourth, Fifth, and Ninth Amendments, basically those that protect against self-incrimination and government overreach.
They were serious about rolling back what they saw as government intrusion into people's lives.
Yeah.
And they didn't just stop at federal laws, did they?
Not at all. They also called out state-level policies that they believed were eroding privacy rights.
Okay.
For example, they were really opposed to the use of red light cameras, arguing that they were a form of sneaky surveillance.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's easy to see those kinds of policies as simply about safety, but they were raising a flag about the potential for those technologies to be misused.
Precisely. They were concerned about the gradual normalization of surveillance and the potential for those technologies to be used to track and monitor citizens in ways that go far beyond their original intent.
So it was about being vigilant, about questioning the trade-offs between security and freedom, even at the local level. And this commitment to individual liberty extended to their views on property rights as well.
Correct. Absolutely. They dedicated an entire article in the Articles of Freedom to property rights, emphasizing how crucial they are to individual liberty and economic prosperity. They even quoted a rancher named Wayne Haig, who put it very bluntly: either you have the right to own property or you are property.
That's a powerful statement. It
Yeah.
really cuts to the core of what they believed.
Yeah.
So what did they see as the biggest threats to property rights?
Well, they were concerned about threats from both domestic and international sources. On the domestic front, they were particularly worried about the use of eminent domain, the government's power to seize private property for public use.
Right, like when they need to build a highway or a school.
Exactly. But they felt it was being abused, especially in light of a recent Supreme Court case, Kelo v. City of New London, which allowed the government to take private property for economic development purposes.
Really?
Basically, the city was allowed to seize homes in a working-class neighborhood and hand the land over to private developers to build things like a hotel and upscale housing.
Wow. So even if the government wasn't directly using the land itself, they could still take it from one private owner and give it to another.
That's what the Supreme Court decided, much to the outrage of the Articles of Freedom authors. They saw it as a blatant violation of the Fifth Amendment's Takings Clause, which says private property can't be taken for public use without just compensation. And they argued that taking someone's home to build a shopping mall doesn't really qualify as public use.
Yeah, it sounds like they were pretty fired up about that case.
They were. They called for the passage of a Property Rights Protection Act to overturn the Kelo decision and prevent the use of eminent domain for private gain.
So they were looking for ways to strengthen legal protections for property owners and prevent what they saw as government overreach.
Exactly. They also called for strengthening the Fifth Amendment to require just compensation for what are called regulatory takings. That's when government regulations, like environmental regulations, significantly reduce the value of your property, even if they don't outright take the land.
It's almost like the government is taking away your property rights without actually taking the property.
That was their argument. They believed property owners should be compensated if government actions diminish the value of their land, even if it's not a complete seizure.
So for them, it was all about fairness, about making sure the government doesn't run roughshod over the rights of property owners. And this concern about property rights wasn't just limited to domestic policies, was it? You mentioned they were also worried about threats from international organizations.
Right. Remember we talked about how they were wary of this concept of global commons?
Yeah, the idea that some resources belong to everyone, not just individual nations.
Exactly. They were really concerned that international organizations might use this concept to justify taking control of resources, even within the U.S., potentially in the name of environmental protection. Imagine the UN declaring that a huge swath of American farmland is now part of the global commons to protect biodiversity, for instance.
That would certainly be controversial. It sounds like they were trying to get ahead of what they saw as a potential threat to national sovereignty and individual property rights.
Exactly. They believed that national governments had a duty to protect their citizens' property rights from these kinds of international interventions. It all ties back to their core belief in limited government, individual liberty, and national sovereignty.
So looking back on this document, what do you think is its lasting significance? It was written over 15 years ago, but it feels like so many of the issues they raised are still relevant today.
That's what makes it so fascinating. It's like a time capsule from a moment when anxieties about government overreach, globalization, and the erosion of individual liberty were really coming to a head. And those anxieties haven't gone away. If anything, they've only intensified in the years since.
That's a good point. We're still grappling with these questions about the balance between security and freedom, the role of government in our lives, and the future of American sovereignty in an increasingly globalized world. The Articles of Freedom may offer one particular perspective, but it reminds us that these debates are far from over.
Exactly. What's so valuable about this document is that it forces us to confront these fundamental questions about what it means to be a citizen in a free society. It reminds us that we have a responsibility to be engaged, to hold our leaders accountable, and to defend the principles that make self-government possible.
It's a call to action, an invitation to participate in the great American experiment of self-government.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this. What does it mean to you to live in a country founded on the ideals of individual liberty and limited government? What role do you see yourself playing in upholding those ideals? The Articles of Freedom offers one possible answer, but ultimately the answer lies with each of us.